Lewis and Reinhold, Volume 1, page 227 to 247, The Roman Revolution. The change in economy. These selections highlight two new sources of wealth opened up to the Romans by their overseas conquests: an abundance of cheap slaves for latifundist operations and lucrative opportunities in money lending and trade. Members of the senatorial class, disbarred from commercial activities by a law of C.218 NBC, participated in the Equestrian Corporation as silent partners, investing in the name of a freedman or other client. According to the following account, even Cato, despite his vigorous opposition to the new economic, political, and cultural influences emanating from the conquest, and despite his express declaration that agriculture was the only honorable source of income for a gentleman, did not disdain to increase his wealth through the economic activities he condemned. The rise of the latifundia. The Romans, as they subdued the Italian people successfully in war, used to seize a part of their lands and build towns there, or enroll colonists of their own to occupy those already existing, with the idea of using those as outposts. But of the land acquired by war, they assigned the cultivated part forthwith to the colonists, or sold or decreased it, since they had no leisure as yet to allot the part which they lay desolate by war. This was generally the greater part. They made proclamations that in the meantime those who were willing to work it might do so for a toll of the yearly crops, namely a tenth of the grain and a fifth of the fruit. From those who kept flocks was required a toil of the animals, both oxen and small cattle. They did these things in order to multiply the Italian people, whom they considered very hardy, so that they might have plenty of allies at home. But the very opposite thing happened for the rich, taking possession of the greater part of the undistributed lands and being emboldened by the lapse of time to believe that they would never be dispossessed, absorbing any adjacent stripes and their poor neighbors' allotments, partly by purchase under persuasion and partly by force, came to cultivate vast tracts instead of single estates, using purchased slaves as agricultural laborers and herdsmen, since free laborers could be drawn from agriculture into the army. At the same time, the ownership of the slaves brought them great gain from the multitude of their progeny, who increased free from danger because they were exempt from military service. Thus, certain powerful men became extremely rich, and the class of slaves multiplied throughout the country. While the Italian people dwindled in numbers and strength, opposed by penury, taxes, and military service, if they had any respite from these evils, they passed their time in idleness because the land was held by the rich, who employed slaves instead of free men as cultivators. When Roman manners were such as these, not only did Italy produce sufficient for its needs without relying on any of the provinces for its food, but also the price of provisions was incredibly cheap. In the year in which the Mother of the Gods was brought to Rome, the harvest of the summer, it is said, was more abundant than it had been for 10 years before. Marcus Varro informs us that in the year in which Lucius Metellus exhibited so many elephants in his triumphal procession, a modius of spelt sold for 1 as, which was the price likewise of a congius of wine, 30 pounds, weight of dried figs, 10 pounds of olive oil, or 12 pounds of meat. Nor did this cheapness originate in the latifundia of individuals encroaching continually upon their neighbors. For by the laws of Licinius Stolo, the landed property of each individual was limited to 500 ayugera. He himself was convicted under his own law of possessing more than that amount by registering some in his son's name. Such was the cease of estates when the state was growing apace. Well known too is the remark uttered by Manius Curius after his triumphs that added an immense extent of territory to the Roman sway. Any man for whom 7 ayugera of land are not enough must be regarded as a dangerous citizen, for that was the amount of land that was allotted to the plebs after the expulsion of the kings. What then was the cause of this great fertility? Why, the facet that in those days the lands were tilled by the hands of the very generals, the soil exalted beneath the plowshare crowned with wreaths of laurel, and guided by a husbandman graced with triumphs. But today these same lands are tilled by slaves whose legs are in chains by the hands of malefactors and men with branded continents, and we are surprised that the yields from the labor of workhouse slaves are not the same as from the honest toil of warriors. New business ventures, the example of Cato. Cato purchased a great many slaves out of the captives taken in war, but chiefly brought up the young ones who, like whelps and colts, were still capable of being reared and trained. None of these ever entered into another man's house unless sent either by Cato himself or his wife. If any one of them were asked what Cato did, he answered only that he did not know. When at home, a slave had to be either at work or asleep. Indeed, Cato greatly favored the sleepy ones, accounting them more docile than those who were wakeful, and more fit for anything when refreshed with slumber than those who lacked it. Being also of this opinion that the greater cause of misbehavior in slaves was their sexual passions, he arranged for the males to consort with the females at a fixed price, and permitted none to approach a woman outside the household. At first, when he was but a poor soldier, he was not difficult in anything which related to his eating, declaring it was shameful to quarrel with a slave for the belly's sake. But afterwards, when he grew richer and gave feasts for his friends and colleagues in office, as soon as dinner was over, he used to go with a leather thong and flog those who had been at all remiss in preparing or serving it. He always contrived, too, that his slaves should have some dissension and difference among themselves, always suspecting and fearing harmony among them. Those who were thought to have committed an offense worthy of death he had judged by the entire body of slaves and put to death if convicted. But being much given to the desire of gain, he looked another agriculture as a pleasure rather than a profit, and invested his money in safe and sure things. He purchased ponds, hot springs, grounds full of fuller earths, works, and lands containing natural pastures and wood, all of which yielded him large returns and could not, as he used to say, be damaged even by Jupiter himself. He also engaged in the most odious form of money lending, namely bottom-ree loans. His method was the following. He required the borrowers to take numerous partners. When they and their ships numbered 50, he himself took one share through his freedom Quintio, who sailed with the borrowers and worked with them. Thus, the risk was not his entirely, but only in the small part, and at great profit. He also lent money to those of his slaves who wished it. They would buy boys, and after training and teaching them in Cato's expense, would sell them again after a year. Many of these Cato would keep for himself, crediting the trainer slave with the price offered by the higher bidder. To incline his son to such procedures, he used to tell him that it was not like a man, but rather like a widow woman, to lessen an estate. But the strongest indication of Cato's avaricious nature was when he went so far as to affirm that that man was most wonderful, nay, godlike, who left more behind in his final accounting than he had inherited. The overseas conquest of the Roman Republic brought huge numbers of slaves to Italy, where they were employed as latifundia and to a lesser extent in industry and commerce. The bulk of these slaves were war captives, but considerable numbers were enslaved also by pirates preying on the shipping lanes and by slave traders who raided barbarian regions to help supply the demands of the slave markets of the Roman Empire. We have no way of estimating even approximately the total slave population of the Roman world, but some idea of the numbers involved can be obtained from statistics such as the following. We read of 5,000 prisoners taken in Macedonia in 197 BC and over 5,000 in Ithria in 177, 80,000 slain and captured by some year in Sardinia, 150,000 Epirotes enslaved in 167, some 60,000 taken at Carthage in 146, 140,000 Teutons and Cimbrians captured by Marius in 102-1 BC. Caesar is said to have taken nearly 500,000 captives in his 9 years in Gaul. Every slave we own is an enemy we harbor. So ran a Roman proverb born of the series of bloody uprisings that marked the last 2 centuries of the Republic. There were many of these revolts, says one ancient writer, and more than 1,000,000 slaves were killed in them. Athenaeus Salvinis at Dinner. 3 of these revolts attained the proportions of full-fledged wars, for which the Romans were compelled to mount major military efforts. The Great Slave War described below erupted on the latifundia of Sicily in 133 BC. Before it was finally ended in 131, the slave army in Sicily had swollen to 70,000 or more, and their successes had provided the signal for sporadic outbreaks in various parts of the empire. The threatened invasion of Italy by Germanic tribes at the end of the 2nd century BC was accomplished by a second great slave uprising in Sicily, 104 to 100 BC, and by other lesser flare-ups elsewhere. The last of this series was the revolt of the gladiators led by Spartacus, who terrorized the entire Italian peninsula for over 2 years, 73 to 71 BC. More than 100,000 slaves were killed in the fighting, and the 6,000 who were captured were crucified along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome. Never had there been such an uprising of the slaves as now occurred in Sicily. In it, many cities experienced terrible misfortunes, and untold numbers of men, women, and children suffered most grievous calamities. And the whole island was on the point of falling into power of the runaways who set the complete destruction of their masters as the goal of their power. To most people, these events came to pass unlooked for and unexpectedly, but to men of competent political judgment, their occurrence did not seem unreasonable. For on account of the immense wealth of those exploiting this rich island, practically all the very wealthy reveled in luxury, arrogance, and insolence. Consequently, as the slaves hated of their masters, increased pari passu with the masters' cruelty towards their slaves. The hatred burst forth one day at an opportune moment, Then, without prearrangement, many thousands of slaves quickly gathered together to destroy their masters. A similar thing happened in Asia about the same time when Andronicus claimed the kingdom not belonging to him, and slaves, because of their master's cruelty, joined his desperate struggle and involved many cities in the great calamities. The Civil War broke out from the following cause. The Sicilians, being grown very rich and elegant in their manner of living, brought up large numbers of slaves. They brought them in droves from the places where they were reared and immediately branded them with marks on their bodies. Those that were young they used as shepherds, and the others as need required. Oppressed by the grinding toil and beating, maltreated for the most part beyond all reason, the slaves could endure it no longer. Therefore, meeting together at suitable opportunities, they discussed revolt until at last they put their plan into effect. There was a Syrian from Apamea named Eunice, a slave of Antigenes of Enna, a kind of magician and conjurer. He claimed to foretell future events from divine revelations in his dreams, and he imposed upon many by his cleverness in this. Before the revolt, he used to boast that the Syrian goddess had appeared to him and told him that he would be king, and he repeated this not only to others but even to his own master. The whole revolt began in the following manner. There was a man in Enna named Damophilus, magnanimous in his wealth but arrogant in disposition. This man was exceedingly cruel to his slaves, and his wife Megalis strove to outdo her husband in torture and general inhumanity toward them. As a result, those who were thus cruelly abused were enraged like wild beasts and plotted together to rise in arms and kill their masters. They applied to Eunice and asked whether the gods would speed them in their design. Performing some of his usual mumbo jumbo, he concluded that the gods granted it and urged them to begin at once. Thereupon, they forthwith collected 400 of their fellow slaves, and when the opportunity presented itself, they burst fully armed into the city of Enna, and Eunice leading them and performing tricks with flames of the fire for them, they stole into the houses and wrought great slaughter. They spared not even the suckling babes, but tore them from the breast and dashed them upon the ground. It cannot be expressed with what wanton outrage they treated wives before the very eyes of their husbands. They were joined by a large throng of the slaves in the city, who first visited the extreme penalty upon their masters and then turned to murdering others. Then they chose Eunice king not for his valor nor for his generalship, but only on account of his conjuring power and the fact that he had led the revolt. Also, his name seemed like a good omen, portending kindness to his subjects. After being appointed absolute ruler by the rebels, he summoned an assembly and ordered all the inhabitants of the Enna that had been taken prisoner put to death, except such as were skilled in the manufacture of arms. These he put to work. Eunice himself killed his own master Antigenes and his wife Pytho. Then, wearing a crown and adorned with all the other insignia of royalty, he designed his wife, a Syrian from the same city as himself, as queen, and formed a council of those reputed to be outstanding in intelligence. After arming over 6,000 men as best he could in the space of 3 days, and collected in addition others equipped with axes, hatchers, slings, sickles, stakes, burnt and sharpened at one end, or cook's spit, he went about plundering the whole country. He attracted a boundless number of slaves and was emboldened to engage in war, even with Roman generals. And in these encounters, he overpowered them with many by force of numbers, for he had over 10,000 soldiers. In the meantime, one Cleon, a Sicilian, began another revolt of slaves. This fellow, hearing of the success of Eunice and the good luck of his followers, persuaded some of the slaves nearby to join with him in revolt and overran the city of Agrigentum and the countryside round about. Now all were in high hopes that the two groups would make war upon each other, that the rebels would thus destroy themselves and free Sicily of the revolt. But contrary to expectation, they joined forces. Cleon was observant to Eunice's very command, and discharged the function of a general serving his king, even though he had 5,000 soldiers of his own. It was now nearly 30 days since the beginning of the revolt. Shortly thereafter, the praetor Lucius Hypatia arrived from Rome and met them in battle at the head of 8,000 soldiers mobilized in Sicily. The rebels, now 20,000 in number, were victorious, and before long their army increased to 200,000 men, and they won renown in many battles with the Romans and made few false steps. Upon this being noised abroad, slave revolts flared up in Rome, where 150 conspired against the government. In Athens, over 1,000 involved in Delos and in many other places, but the government officials in the several places quickly suppressed with prompt action and terrible torture as punishment, so that others who were hovering on the point of revolt were recalled to their senses. But in Sicily, the evil kept increasing. Cities were taken and their inhabitants enslaved, and many armies were cut to pieces by the rebels until the Roman general Republius recovered Tauromenium for the Romans after besieging it tightly and reducing the rebels to such indescribable famine and suffering that they began to eat the children, then the women, and were finally even driven to eating one another. There he captured Cumanus, the brother of Cleon. As he was endeavoring to escape out of the besieged city, finally a Syrian named Charopion betrayed the citadel, and the general seized all the runaways in the city, whom he scourged and then crucified. Thence he marched to Enna, and by a like siege reduced the hopes of the rebels to the last extremity. Their general Cleon sallied forth from the city and fought heroically, but before long collapsed beneath his wounds, and his corpse was exposed to open view. Then the city too was betrayed in Rupilius' hands, for its strong natural position made it impregnable. Junius gathered up his 600 bodyguards and fled like a coward to the top of an abrupt cliff, where those with him, realizing that their doom was inevitable, for already Rupilius was coming after them, cut one another's throats. After that, Rupilius overran all Sicily with a few picked companies of men that cleared it of all brig- brigandage more quickly than anyone had hoped. Such are the events overseas of the third period of the history of the Roman people, during which, having once ventured to advance outside Italy, they carried their arms over the whole world. The first 100 years of this period were pure and righteous, and as we have said, a golden age free from vice and crime, while the innocence of the old pastoral life was still untainted and uncorrupted, and the imminent threat of our Carthaginian foes kept alive the ancient discipline. The following 100 years, which we have traced from the destruction of Carthage, Corinth, and Numantia, and the inheritance of the Asiatic kingdom of Attalus, down to the time of Caesar and Pompey and of their successor Augustus, with whose history we still have to deal, were as unhappy and deplorable owing to internal calamities as they were illustrious for the glory of their military achievement. For just as it was honorable and glorious to have won the rich and powerful provinces of Gaul, Thrace, Sicilia, and Cappadocia, as well as the territory of the Armenians and Britons, which, though they brought no material benefit, constituted important titles to imperial greatness. So it was disgraceful and deplorable at the same time to have fought at home with fellow citizens and allies, with slaves and gladiators, and with the whole Senate divided against itself. Indeed, I know not whether it would not have been better for the Roman people to have been content with Sicily and Africa, or even to have been without these and to have held dominion over only over their own land of Italy, than to increase to such greatness that they were ruined by their own strength. For what else produced those outbursts of domestic strife but excessive prosperity? It was the conquest of Syria which first corrupted us, followed by the Asiatic inheritance bequeathed by the king of Pergamum. The resources and wealth thus acquired spoiled the morals of the age and ruined the state, which was engulfed in its own vices, as is a common sewer. For what else caused the Roman people to demand land and food for their tribunes, except the scarcity which luxury had produced? Hence arose the first and second Graccan revolutions, and the third raised by Appius. What was the cause of the violent division between the equestrian order and the Senate on the subject of the judiciary laws, except avarice, in order that the revenues of the state and the law courts themselves might be exploited for private profit? Hence arose the attempt of Drusus and the promise of citizenship to the Latins, which resulted in war with our allies. Again, what brought the civil wars upon us except the excessive size of our slave establishment? How else could those armies of gladiators have arisen against their master slave that a profuse expenditure which aimed at winning the favor of the common people by indulging their love to shows had turned what was originally a method of punishing enemies into a competition of skill? Again, to touch upon less ugly vices, was not ambition for office also stimulated by the wealth? Why, it was from such ambition that the Marian and Sullan disturbances arose. Again, were not the sumptuous extravagances of banquet and profuse largeness due to a wealth which was bound soon to produce want? That was what brought Catiline into collision with his country finally. Whence did the lust for personal power and domination arise? Save from excessive wealth, it was this lust which aimed Caesar and Pompey with the raging torches and destroyed the state. His brother Gaius recorded in one of his writings that when Tiberius, on his way to Numantia, passed through Etruria and found the country almost depopulated and its husbandmen and shepherds imported barbarian slaves, he, Tiberius, first conceived a policy which was to be the source of countless ills to himself and to his brother, but it was the people themselves who chiefly excited his zeal and determination with writings on the porticos, walls, and monuments, calling on him to retrieve the public land of the poor. However, he did not draw up this law by himself, but sought the advice of the citizens who were the most eminent for their virtue and authority. Among these were Crassus, the Pontiff ex Maximus, Marcius Scaevola, the jurist, who was then consul, and Appius Claudius, his father-in-law. Never, it seems, was a law directed against such great injustice and avarice drafted in milder and gentler terms for men who should have been punished as lawbreakers, who should have been fined and made to surrender the land which they were illegally exploiting, were granted compensation for quitting their unlawful acquisitions so the citizens in need of assistance could have them. But though the terms of the reform were so favorable and the people were willing to let bygones be bygones if they could be secure from such wrong in the future, yet the men of wealth and property were led by their greed to hate the law and by their anger and party spirit to hate the lawgiver. They endeavored to dissuade the people by charging the Tiberius was introducing by charging that Tiberius was introducing a redistribution of lands in order to cause dissension in the state and was starting a general revolution. But they had no success, for Tiberius, fighting for an honorable and just cause with an eloquence that would have dignified even a meaner cause, was formidable and invincible whenever, with the people crowding around the rostra, he took his place and spoke in behalf of the poor. The wild beasts that roam over Italy, he said, have their dens, each has a place of repose and refuge. But the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy nothing but the air and light without house or home. They wander about with their wives and children. Their commanders lie with when they exhort the soldiers in battle to defend sepulchres and shrines from the enemy. For not one of these many Romans has ever hereditary altar or ancestral tomb. They fight and die to protect the wealth and luxury of others. They are styled masters of the world and have not a clod of earth they can call their own. About this time, King Attalus Philometor died, and Eudemus of Pergamum brought to Rome his last will, in which the Roman people was named the king's heir. Tiberius promptly proposed a law of popular appeal, provided that the king's money, when brought to Rome, should be distributed among those of the citizens receiving allotments of public land, to provide them with equipment and give them a start in farming. As for the cities that were in the kingdom of Attalus, he declared that the disposal of them was not the Senate business, but that he himself would put a resolution before the people. But by this he offended the Senate more than ever. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, an illustrious man, eager for glory, a most powerful speaker, and for those reasons well known to all, delivered an eloquent discourse while serving a tribune lamenting the facts that the Italians, a people so valiant in war and related in blood to the Romans, were declining little by little into pauperism and a paucity of numbers without any hope of remedy. He inveighed against the multitude of slaves as useless in war and never faithful to their masters, and adduced the recent calamity brought upon the masters by their slaves in Sicily, where the demands of agriculture had greatly increased the number of the latter, recalling also that the war waged against them by the Romans were neither easy nor short, but long protracted and full of vicissitudes and dangers. After speaking thus, he again brought forward the law providing that nobody should hold more than 500 ayugera of public domain. But he added a provision to the former law that two sons of the occupiers might each hold one half of that amount, and that the remainder should be divided among the poor by three elected commissioners who should be changed annually. This was extremely disturbing to the rich because on account of the commissioners, they could no longer discard the law as they had done before, nor could they buy from those receiving allotments because Gracchus had provided against this by forbidding such sales. They collected together in groups and made lamentation and accused the poor of appropriating their fields of long standing, their vineyards, and their buildings. Some said they had paid the price of the land to their neighbors. Were they to lose the money with the land? Others said the graves of their ancestors were in the ground, which had been allotted to them in the division of their fathers' estates. Others said that their wives' dowries had been expended on these estates, or that the land had been given to their own daughters as dowry. Moneylenders could show loans made on this security. All kinds of wailing and expressions of indignation were heard at once. On the other side were heard the lamentations of the poor that they were being reduced from competence to extreme poverty, and from that to childlessness because they were unable to rear their offsprings. They recounted the military service they had rendered, by which this very land had been acquired, and were angry that they should be robbed of their shares of the common property. They reproached the rich for employing slaves who were always faithless and ill disposed, and for that reason exempted the military service instead of freemen, citizens, and soldiers. While these classes were thus lamenting and indulging in mutual recriminations, a great number of others, colonists or inhabitants of municipalities or persons otherwise interested in this land, who were under like apprehensions, flocked in and took sides with their respective factions. Emboldened by numbers and exasperated against each other, they kindled incessant disturbances and waited eagerly for the voting of the new law, some intending to prevent its enactment by all means, and others to enact it at all cost. With Gracchus what Gracchus had in mind in proposing the measure was not wealth of money but wealth of men, inspired greatly by the usefulness of the work and believing that nothing more advantageous or admirable could ever happen to Italy. He took no account of the difficulties surrounding it. When the time for voting came, he advanced many other arguments at considerable length, but asked them especially whether it was not just to divide the common property among the commons, whether a city was not worthy of more consideration at all times than a slave, whether a man who served in the army was not whether a man who served in the army was not more
useful than one who did not, and whether one who had a share in the country was not more likely to be devoted to the public interest. He did not dwell long on this comparison between freemen and slaves, which he considered degrading, but proceeded at once to a review of their hopes and fears for the country, saying that the Romans possessed most of their territory by conquest and that they had hopes of occupying the rest of the habitable world. But now the question of greatest hazard was whether they should gain the rest by having plenty of brave men, or through their weakness and mutual jealousy lose to their enemies that they already possessed, what they already possessed. After exaggerating the glory and riches on the one side and the danger and the fear on the other, he admonished the rich to take heed and said that for the realization of these hopes they ought to bestow this land as a free gift, if necessary, on men who would rear children and not, by quarreling about small things, overlook larger ones, especially since they were receiving ample compensation for any improvements they had made by obtaining without cost absolute title, guaranteed forever to 500 ayugera apiece and half as much more for each son, up to two in the case of those who had sons, after saying much more to the same purport and exciting the poor, as well as others who were moved by reason rather than by desire for gain, he ordered the clerk to read the proposed law. When under pressure from the Senate, Marcus Octavius, one of the 10 tribunes, vetoed the law. Gracchus had him deposed from office by a vote of the assembly, an act without precedent in Roman constitutional history. The agrarian law was then enacted. The first commissioners elected to divide the land with Gracchus himself, the proposer of the law, his brother of the same name, and his father-in-law Appius Claudius, since the people still feared that the law might fail of execution unless Gracchus, together with the whole family, took the lead. Gracchus, immensely popular by reason of the law, was escorted home by the multitudes as though he were the founder not of a single city or people, but of all the nations of Italy. After this victorious party returned to the fields from which they had come to attend to this business, the defeated ones remained in the city and talked the matter over, feeling aggrieved and saying that as soon as Gracchus should become a private citizen, he would be sorry that he had done outrage to the sacred and inviolable office of tribune and had sown in Italy so many seeds of future strife. It was now summer, and the election of tribunes was imminent. As the day for the voting approached, it was evident that the rich had earnestly prompted the election of those most inimical to Gracchus, the latter, fearing that evil would befall if he should not be re-elected for the following year, summoned his friends from the fields to the election. But as they were occupied with the harvest, he was obliged, when the day fixed for the voting drew near, to have recourse to the plebeians of the city. So he went around asking each other in turn to elect him tribune for the ensuing year, in view of the danger he was incurring for their sake. When the voting took place, the first two tribes pronounced for Gracchus. The rich thereupon objected that it was unconstitutional for the same man to hold the office twice in succession. Gracchus assembled his partisans before daybreak and communicated to them a signal to be displayed if there was need for fighting. He then took possession of the capital where the voting was to take place and occupied the middle of the assembly. As he was obstructed by the other tribunes and by the rich, who would not allow the votes to be taken on this question, he gave the signal. There was a sudden shout from those who knew of it, and violence followed. Some of the partisans of Gracchus took position around him like bodyguards. Others, girding up their cloaks, seized the faces and staves in the hands of the lictors and broke them in pieces. They drove the rich out of the assembly with such disorder and wounds that the tribunes fled from their places in terror, and the priests closed the doors of the temple. Many ran away pell mell and scattered wild rumors. Some said that Gracchus had deposed all the other tribunes, conjuring this because none of them could be seen. Others said that he had declared himself tribune for the ensuing year without an election. In these circumstances, the Senate assembled at the Temple of Fides. After reaching such decision as they did reach, they marched up to the capital. Cornelius Scipio Nasica, the Pontifex Maximus, leading the way. When he arrived at the temple and advanced against the partisans of Gracchus, they yielded out of regard for so distinguished a citizen and because they observed the senators following with him, the latter wresting the clubs out of the hands of the Gracchus themselves, and breaking up benches and other furniture that had been brought for the use of the assembly, began beating them, pursued them, and drove them over the precipice. In the tumult, many of the Graccans perished, and Gracchus himself, vainly circling around the temple, was slain at the door, close to the statues of the king. All the bodies were thrown by night into the Tiber. Gracchus Reform Program. Gaius Gracchus Reform Program. Gaius now came forward to ask for the tribuneship, though he was universally opposed by all persons of distinction, yet there came such infinite numbers of people from all parts of Italy to vote for him that lodgings for many could not be provided in the city, and the Campus Martius not being large enough to contain the assembly, there were many who climbed upon the roofs and tilings of the houses to use their voices in his favor. However, the nobility so far forced the people to their will and disappointed Gaius' hopes that he was not returned the first, as he expected, but the fourth tribune. But when he came to the execution of his office, it was quickly seen who was really first tribune, as he was a more powerful orator than any of his contemporaries, and his affection gave him a greater boldness in speaking as he lamented his brother's death. Having moved the people's passion with such addresses, he proposed two laws. The first provided that many magistrates deprived of his office should be thereby disbarred from holding any future office. The second made liable to prosecution before the people any magistrate who had condemned a citizen to be banished without trial. The first of these laws was manifestly leveled at Marcus Octavius, who had been deposed from the tribuneship at Tiberius' instigation. The second affected Publius, who in his consulship had banished Tiberius' friends. Whereupon Publius, being unwilling to risk a trial, fled out of Italy. As for the former law, it was withdrawn by Gaius himself, who said he spared Octavius at the request of his mother Cornelia. Of the laws which he now proposed with the object of gratifying the people and destroying the power of the Senate, the first concerned public lands, which were to be divided among the poor citizens. Another provided that the common soldiers should be clothed at public expense without any reduction in pay, and that no one under 17 years of age should be conscripted for military service. Another concerned the Allies, giving the Italians equal suffrage rights with the citizens of Rome. A fourth related to grain, lowering the market price for the poor. A fifth dealing with the courts of justice was the greatest blow to the power of the senators, for here too they alone could sit on the juries, and they were therefore much dreaded by the plebs and equits, but Gaius joined 300 citizens of equestrian rank with the senators, who were also 300 in number, and made jury service the common prerogative of the 600. When the people not only ratified this law, but gave him power to select those of the equites who were to serve as jurors. He was invested with almost kingly power, and even the Senate submitted to receiving his counsel, nor did he advise any measure that might derogue, derogate from the honor of that body. For example, the decree about the grain which the pro- propractor Fabius sent from Spain was very equitable and honorable, for he persuaded the Senate to sell the grain and send the money back to the Spanish cities, and also to censure Fabius for rendering his government of the province odious and intolerable to the inhabitants. This earned him great respect and goodwill in the provisions. He also proposed measuring for sending out colonies, for constructing roads, and for building public granaries. He himself undertook the management and superintendence of all these works, and was never too busy to attend to the execution of all three indifferent and great undertakings. His most special exertions were given to the road construction, in which he had an eye to beauty and grace as well as to utility, for the roads were carried through the country in a perfectly straight line, and were paved with hewn stone and reinforced with banks of tight rammed sands. Depressions were filled up, and intersecting torrents of ravines were bridged, and both the sides were of equal and corresponding height, so that the work presented everywhere even and beautiful appearance. Besides all this, he measured off all the roads by miles, and planted stone pillars as distance markers. He also placed other stones at shorter intervals on both sides of the way, by the help of which travelers might easily mount their horses without needing a groom. Gaius was elected tribune a second time on a wave of popular enthusiasm, without his announcing candidacy or campaigning, and when he realized that the senators were his avowed enemies, and that Fannius' goodwill toward him was only lukewarm, he began again to rally the people with other laws. He proposed that colonies be sent to Tarentum and Capua, and summoned the Latins to equal partnership in Roman citizenship. But the Senate, fearing that he would become altogether invincible, made a new and unusual attempt to alienate the people from him by competing with him in playing the demagogue and gratifying the people contrary to the best interests of the state. One of Gaius's colleagues was Livius Drusus, a man of a good family and breeding, as any of the Romans, and the equal in eloquence and wealth of the men most honored and most powerful in these respects. To him, then, the nobles turned, urging him to join them and attack Gaius, not by resorting to violence or clashing with the common people, but by exercising his office so as to gratify and oblige them, even in matters where sound policy would have incurred their hatred. Livius accordingly offered the Senate the service of his office in this matter, and proceeded to bring forward laws neither honorable or advantageous His one purpose was to outdo Gaius in pleasing and cajoling the populace. Cajoling the populace. His one purpose was to outdo Gaius in pleasing and cajoling the populace. The Senate thus made it perfectly clear that it was not angry with Gaius's public measures, but only anxious to destroy the man himself, or at least to humble him. For when Gaius proposed 2 colonies to which he would admit only the soberest of citizens, they accused him of truckling to the mob. But when Drusus proposed to found 12 colonies and to send out to teach 3,000 of the poor citizens, they supported him. When Gaius divided public land among the needy and charged each of them a small rental to be paid into the treasury, they were angry at him, accusing him of seeking curry favor with the populace. But they commended Livius when he proposed to abolish the rental altogether. And when Gaius was for offering the Latins equal suffrage rights, they were incensed. But when Livius proposed that it be made unlawful for a Latin to be scourged with rods even during military service, they supported his law. Thus Gaius Gracchus was tribune a second time, having brought the plebeians, as it were. He began by another, like political maneuver, to court the equestrian order, which holds the middle rank between senate and plebs. He transferred the courts of justice, which had been discredited by bribery, from the senators to the equites, reproaching the former especially with 3 recent examples of notorious extortioners who had been acquitted by their juries. The envoys sent to complain of the conduct of these men were still present in Rome, going about uttering bitter accusations against them. The Senate was extremely ashamed of these things and yielded to the law, and the people ratified it. In this way, the courts of justice were transferred from the Senate to the equites. It is said that soon after the passage of this law, Gracchus remarked that he had broken the power of the Senate once for all, and the truth of his remark was progressively revealed by the course of events, for this power, sitting in judgment on all Roman and Italians, including the senators themselves, in all matters concerning property, civil rights, and banishment, exalted the equites to be rulers over them, as it were, and reduced the senators to the level of subjects. Moreover, as the equites voted in the election to sustain the power of the tribunes and obtain from them whatever they wanted in return, they became more and more formidable to the senators. Thus, it shortly came about that the political mastery was revised, the equites wielding the power, while the Senate was left with honor alone. The equites indeed went so far that they not only held the whip hand over the senators, but openly flouted them beyond their right. They too became addicted to bribe taking, and when they had tested these enormous gains, they indulged in them even more basely and immoderately than the senators had done. They suborned accusers against the rich and did away with prosecution for bribe taking altogether, partly by agreement among themselves and partly by open violence, so that this kind of inquiry ceased entirely. Thus, the judiciary law gave rise to another struggle of factions, which lasted a long time and was not less baneful than the former ones. After losing the favor of the rebel, Gracchus sailed for Africa together with Volvius Flaccus, who had been chosen tribune after his consulship for the same reasons as Gracchus himself. It had been decided to send a colony to Africa on account of its famed fertility, and these men had been expressly chosen, the founders of it, in order to get them out of the way for a while, who that the Senate might have a respite from their demagogy, they marked out the city for the colonies on the site where Carthage had previously stood, disregarding the fact that Scipio, when he destroyed it, had devoted it with solemn imprecations to sheep pasture forever. They marked out lands for 6,000 colonists instead of the smaller number fixed by the law in order to curry favor with the people. When they returned to Rome, they invited the 6,000 from the whole of Italy. The functionaries who were still in Africa laying out the city wrote him the wolves had pulled up the scattered the boundary makers of Gracchus and Fulvius. The soothsayers considered this an ill omen for the colony, and the Senate summoned the assembly to propose this repeal of the law concerning this colony. When Gracchus and Fulvius saw their failure in this matter, they were furious and declared that the Senate had lied about the wolves. The boldest of the plebeians joined them carrying daggers and proceeded to the capital where the assembly was to be held. In reference to the colony, now the people had come together, and Fulvius was beginning to speak to the matter in questions when Gracchus arrived at the capital attended by a bodyguard of his partisans. Gracchus went into the forum anxious to exculpate himself of the killing, but no one would listen to him. All turned away from him as from one stained with blood. Both he and Flaccus were at their wits' end, and having lost this by this rash act the chances of accomplishing what they desired, they hastened to their homes, accompanied by their supporters. After midnight, the rest of the crowd occupied the forums as though some calamity were impending, and the consul Opimius, who was staying in the city, ordered an army force to gather at the capital at daybreak and sent heralds to convoke the Senate. He took his own station in the temple of Castor and Pollux in the center of the city, and there waited developments. When these arrangements had been made, the Senate summoned Gracchus and Fulvius from their homes to defend themselves, but they fled armed to the Aventine Hill, hoping that if they could seize it first, the Senate would agree to some terms with them. As they ran through the city, they summoned the slaves to freedom, but none listened to them. With such forces as they had, however, they occupied the fortified the temple of Diana and sent Quintus Flaccus' son to the Senate with an offer to reach an accommodation and live in harmony. The Senate replied that they should lay down their arms, come to the Senate house, and tell what they wanted, or else send no more messengers. When they sent Quintus a second time, the consul Opimius arrested him on the grounds that he was no longer an ambassador after the above warning, and sent his soldiers against the Graccans. Gracchus fled with one slave by the wooden bridge across the river Togrove, and there, when on the point of capture, he presented his throat to the slave. Flaccus took refuge in the shop of an acquaintance, as his pursuers did not know which house he was in. They threatened to burn the whole row. The man who had given him shelter scrupled to point him out, but directed another to do so. Flaccus was seized and put to death. The head of Gracchus and Flaccus were carried to Opimius, who gave their weight in gold to those who brought them, and people plundered their houses. Opimius arrested their fellow conspirators, cast them into prison, and ordered them to be strangled. But he allowed Quintus Flaccus' son to choose his own manner of death. After this, he performed a lustration of the city for the bloodshed, and the Senate ordered him to erect a temple of Concord in the Forum. The assassinations of each of the Gracchus brothers was followed by a decade of senatorial reaction. Nevertheless, the reforms they had championed could not be entirely or immediately undone. In particular, the land commissions continued to function until 118 BC, and the land assignment made by them remained in force. Concrete evidence is afforded by a series of extant inscribed boundary stones attesting their activity, a few of which are reproached here. Technical surveying marks are here omitted. It is especially striking to find Popilius Lanus, who, as consul in 132, presided over the bloody purge of Tiberius Gracchus' followers, publicly proclaiming that he was the first to carry out the provisions of Gracchus's land law. Near Forum Pulli in Lucania, 132 BC, Publius Pullius, son of Gaius Consul, I built a road from Rhegium to Capua, and on that road I placed all the bridges, milestones, and signposts. From hence it is 51 miles to Nuceria, 84 to Capua, 74 to Manranum, 123 to Consentia, 180 to Valencia, Valentia, 231 to the Strait of Messina at the statue, 237 to Rhegium. Total from Capua to Rhegium, 321. I also, as praetor in Sicily, hunted down the runaway slaves belonging to men from Italy and handed back 917 to their owners. Further, I was the first to make cattle breeders retire from public state land in favor of plowmen. Here I erected a market and a public building.